Welcome to the second module. In this module, we're mainly going to be talking about organizational justice, which definitely draws heavily from psychological research on how people respond to decisions based on how they perceive the justice, ethics, and corporate social responsibility. So the ethics is going to also draw from psychology, but it's also going to be driven by economic and legal factors. Many organizations face specific legislation and laws based on their ethical behavior. And obviously, also in today's environment, a lot of customers expect companies to be more socially responsible in how they present themselves, the decisions they make, and the organizations they support. And again, we're going to be looking at that broadly speaking. So let's just dive right in and start talking about organizational justice, ethics, and social responsibility. So organizational justice is people's perception of fairness in organizations, consisting of their perceptions of how decisions are made regarding the distribution of outcomes and the perceived fairness of those outcomes themselves. Notice perceptions, perceptions, perceived. One of the things to remember is that in many ways, perception trumps reality. And what that means is regardless of the procedures that were made to make a decision, how that decision was made and how outcomes are being decided, the system itself may be incredibly fair, incredibly just, and very systematic. But if the perceptions are that it's unfair, there is no real understanding of how that decision was made, and the fairness of the outcomes themselves are perceived as badly, you're going to have just as much of a problem. So this is really one of the first things that we're going to be talking about, where communication is key. It's not just creating the right structures of fairness in decision making, it's also how do we communicate these structures that we've created? How do we make sure people understand what is the judgment or decision making that's occurring in an organization, especially when those decisions may affect the distribution of outcomes, in other words, promotions, pay raises, bonuses, and how is the fairness of that decision perceived? And communicating that is part of the problem. So when we talk about this, we're going to draw from, again, kind of cognitive psychology that's looked at different forms of justice, including distributive justice, the perceived fairness of the way rewards are distributed. So this is basically, do people feel as if rewards, and by rewards in organizations, we're usually going to be talking about promotions, pay, and bonuses, are being distributed amongst people. So if it is being perceived that people are getting a fair amount of pay for a fair amount of work and that bonuses are determined based on performance, and that's not only the case, but it's also how it's perceived, then we would say that organization has high distributive justice. If these awards are being decided randomly or based on gut feelings or relationships to the boss, that might be a situation where we would say there's low distributive justice. However, low distributive justice isn't just about the procedure, it's also about the perceptions of that procedure. Procedural justice is the perception of the fairness of the procedures used. So there's a little bit of a tweak here. It basically involves how people are perceiving the procedures themselves. So again, distributive justice is just looking at how the awards are distributed. What's that perception? Procedural justice focuses in on what are the procedures that determine how those rewards are being distributed. And again, it often involves whether or not high procedural judgment, for instance, if we said an organization has high procedural justice, that means that the perceptions are that the procedures are very fair. And one of the ways you get this is actually employee involvement. The more the employees are involved in this process, the more likely you're going to find higher ratings of perceived organizational procedural justice. Then there's interactional or interpersonal justice, the perceived fairness of the interpersonal treatment used to determine organizational outcomes. So again, notice that these are very interrelated. But the first one, distributive justice, is about just the distribution of awards. The second one is focused on the actual procedures for those rewards. The interactional piece is how is it perceived as far as how the organization communicates those rewards or outcomes. So what is the process? So even if you have high distributive justice and procedural justice, if the information then is leaked out, it's basically sent in an email that's very impersonal, you might have high distributive justice, high procedural justice, but low interactional justice. And finally, there's informational justice. People's perceptions of the fairness of the information used as the basis for making decisions. So this kind of loops it all back. If you have a fair distributive process with a fair procedure and a fair communication. So those first three levels of justice. But at the end of the day, people still go, yeah, but the whole process is based on our performance feedback, and I don't trust our performance feedback system. Then we'd have lower informational justice. How is that information or data being gathered? So you can kind of see that when we're talking about organizational decisions, any decision that affects individuals within the organization, all of these become a part of the puzzle. How are people perceiving the distributable, the procedural, the interactional, and the informational justice? Obviously, the goal is to have them being highly perceived across the board and highly and clearly communicated from upper management, the decision makers, to the people that are being affected by that decision. And of course, this is directly related to a lot of outcomes. So generally speaking, when we look at organizational justice, again, that distributive, informational, procedural, and interpersonal, we find distributive justice is often most related to satisfaction with the outcomes. In other words, not just job satisfaction, but pay satisfaction, work satisfaction, task satisfaction. The informational judges piece is most related to feeling valued by others in the organization. So how well someone's engaged in the organization and how well people react to others in the organization is usually predicted most by informational. Procedural justice, the more that is high, the generally we find it strongly related to adherence to the rules. In other words, people that have high procedural justice are more likely to follow the procedures of the organization. And finally, interpersonal justice is usually related to feelings about one's leader. So again, if there's high interpersonal justice, we generally find high ratings of the leader. And if there's low interpersonal judgment, we tend to find low ratings of that leader. So you can kind of start to see how distributive, informational, procedural, and interpersonal justice, organizational justice as a whole, are actually at the individual level. How does an individual perceive distributional justice? How does an individual perceive informational justice or interpersonal justice? But then how they're perceiving their attitudes and their opinions do impact their outcomes. And so that's what we're looking at as far as our predictors. So think of this as the middle of the circle. Organizational justice is basically our antecedents. So it's the individual and how they feel. The antecedents result in outcomes. So high distributive justice results generally in high satisfaction with the outcomes. Low distributive justice is usually related to lower satisfaction with the outcomes. So these are actually workplace consequences of not attending to organizational justice. So generally speaking, this theory and the research behind it is partially supported. And what I mean by that is that it generally is supported by research in cognitive psychology. But as you might imagine, people are more influenced by their perceptions of justice when they aren't necessarily getting a good outcome. So what we do find is that, in generally speaking, if you expected a good outcome and you get a good outcome, you're going to be relatively favorable in your perceptions of the process. In other words, I perceived the processes were fair and I got what I wanted. I got the bonus. I got the raise. You're going to be happy. Likewise, if you don't get what you wanted, so it was not a positive outcome, but you perceived it necessarily, you perceived the perceptions favorably, in that case, again, you really don't care. If you got a good outcome, if the outcome was favorable, it doesn't matter if you perceived it as unfair or fair. Both results are going to be very similar. You're going to be happy with the results. The difference occurs when you don't get what you wanted. So if you actually did not get a favorable outcome, in other words, you didn't get the promotion, you didn't get the raise, but you have high perceptions of distributive and procedural justice, the interaction of those, that basically you're still going to be generally positive towards the organization, and we're not expecting to see those negative outcomes. However, if you didn't get the outcome you wanted and you perceive the organization as unfair, in other words, you have negative opinions of the justice and you didn't get your outcome, that's where we're going to find all those negative outcomes we talked about in the previous slide. That's where this organizational justice model is going to predict basically a negative outcome. Considering that a lot of times when we're looking at organizational decisions, a promotion, for instance, there might be a lot of people up for that promotion, but only one person is going to get it. And that's where you can start to see the impact of making sure your distributive and procedural justice is perceived by everyone as fair as possible, that you have clear communication, and that you're very aware of the impact of these decisions. it will have a strong outcome on a larger number. In other words, everyone that didn't get the promotion they were hoping for or the bonus they were hoping for. Compared if that perception of justice is very poor, then the outcomes are also going to be poor. So the harmful effects of perceptions of organizational injustice, and I keep driving this concept that injustice may be real or perceived. So the injustice may be real. It may be very well. It is an unfair system that doesn't use good data, that isn't communicated clearly. All of those things are bad. But also, even if it's well done, if it's perceived as being unfair, it's still going to have these effects, especially on those that don't get the outcome they're hoping for. We're going to see greater stress. We're going to see greater dissatisfaction. There's going to be strained organizational relationships, which is usually going to show up in turnover and lack of engagement. There's going to be a distancing from the company, a breakdown in communication, a lack of trust, higher turnover, and the severity of the effect also depends on the severity of the event. So example, unfair pay versus an unfair policy. And also the pay itself, it might be, so if it was a small bonus that someone didn't get, it may have less of an effect. If it was a large bonus someone didn't get, it might have a larger effect. If the policy has a small effect on the outcome of individuals, we'd see lesser effect. If the policy that is perceived as unfair actually strongly affects how someone does their work, we'd expect to see these results at a much greater level. So maybe you haven't been targeted, but what if your coworker has? Do you feel injustice for them? So for example, is there basically a second-hand effect of perceiving injustice that didn't affect you directly, but affected other people you work with? You may be in a position due to political constraints or lack of power that you can't do anything to help that person or change that policy. This tends to also have an effect, and those negative outcomes don't just affect the person directly affected, they can have a splashover effect on people that they work with, especially if the people that they work with agree that it was an unfair process. It contributes to feelings of helplessness, anger, fatigue, and reduced work productivity. So it's not just the individuals that may be unfairly targeted, it's also those they work with. So perceptions of organizational justice are very important to maintaining a lot of positive outcomes in the workplace. So basically, when we look at organizational justice strategies and promotion strategies, we often want to think about how do we actually create policies which are more likely to result in positive perceptions. Some of these are fairly straightforward. Pay workers what they deserve. So obviously we find less effect, and basically when I say less effect, people tend to have better perceptions of organizational justice when they are also all being paid well for what they do. So this can also be the result of benchmarking. It can be basically an organization really taking a look at what they pay for what skills. But if everyone in the organization is basically making money that they feel that they deserve, you're going to see greater levels of promotional or basically perceptions of justice. Follow open and fair procedures. So if the procedures are well known, if they're documented and they're fully understood, again, you're probably going to see better perceptions. The more that you offer workers a voice in this process, so if there's information being gathered to make the decisions, do the people that are being affected by that decision, is their input and their own perceptions of their performance included in that process? Do they have regular meetings with their supervisors where they are invited to provide input? Does the organization conduct employee surveys to determine how the surveys are feeling about policies? Are the managers keeping an open door policy where people can come in with a complaint? Is there a suggestion system in place? All of these are tools that offer workers voice, and the greater workers perceive that they have voice, generally the higher their perceptions of organizational justice is going to be. Also, once a decision is made, it's important that management explains those decisions thoroughly in a manner demonstrating dignity and respect. So basically, again, that interpersonal and informational justice. And finally, train the people making decisions to be fair. Make it clear that not only do we have a policy about making decisions based on merit and performance, but that is all that should be encountered or encouraged in the decision making that we're seeing in the organization, and then communicate that. In other words, don't just talk the talk, walk the walk. So again, looking at a kind of a model of fair process, for giving employees voice in the process. Employees is given voice in making decisions. When employees are given a voice and allowed to be a part of the decision-making process, they tend to feel valued by the decision-making authorities. It tends to result in greater perceptions of organizational justice. Employees believe the resulting decisions to be fair, and employee accepts the following and follows the decision. Um, and this results in both ways. Also, the employee believes the process on which the decision is based is fair, and employee is supportive of the organization itself. So all of these are the positive outcomes, and this has been strongly supported by psychological research in business settings. So let's switch a little bit to ethical behavior in organizations. And a lot of this breaks down into subgroups of what are the morals and values of the organization. So what are the fundamental beliefs about what is good and bad, right or wrong? Example, it's wrong to harm a person. So this can include religious backgrounds, beliefs, training, levels of cognitive or moral development. But the first thing that we really want to think about when ethics is the moral concept of ethics. So what is acceptable behavior in the culture? What is acceptable behavior within the organization? And what is acceptable behavior for the individuals within that organization and within that culture? Ethics are standards of conduct in keeping with one's moral values. In other words, it's not just wrong to steal, I should not steal. So ethics are generally clearly articulated standards. Training is recognized and applying those ethical standards. So when we think of ethics, we are thinking about what are the actual rules within an organization, and these rules may be set internally. They can also be set by external forces within, again, that kind of open system model, the environment itself. So there may be laws that impact the ethical decisions an organization is making. And generally, an organization wants to match its ethics to the morals of both the legal expectations, but also the culture that's within. Finally, there's the decision of how should we actually decide to behave ethically. So decisions are plans, are planned to behave in an ethical fashion. So I decide not to steal money from a coworker even though I need money would be an example of a decision. And the decision finally leads to behavior, actually taking action based on that. So example, I do not steal. So moral values are the background beliefs that result in an ethical code. Once an ethical code is in existence, we then make decisions or intentions to behave based on that ethical code. But that intention isn't enough. We then have to look, does the actual behavior itself follow? And when we think about this, there are definitely situations which will increase or decrease the likelihood of people following ethics. So if we think of an organization, again, let's think of a financial organization. There obviously is the morals within modern Western society, we'll use the United States as an example, that you shouldn't steal and you shouldn't cheat. The ethical standards of that organization very well may mirror this and include legal requirements of keeping proper records and making sure that we're not cheating customers. However, then we can look at two potential different organizations. One organization basically values success in sales over all else. The other one basically values ethical standards above all else. In the short term, the company focused purely on profit may be making more money, but also it's probably not creating an environment that supports the decisions and behavior to act ethically. While the other organization that puts a strong value on ethics is more likely to have that decision to behave ethically followed by that behavior. So it's not just enough to create an ethical code. You also have to think about at an organizational level, how do we set up a situation that supports people making the decision and doing the behaviors that supports that ethical code? So part of this happens at the individual level. And again, we're drawing from a psychological theory, Kohlberg's theory of cognitive and moral development. And basically, he suggests that there are three levels of moral reasoning: pre-conventional level of moral reasoning, conventional level of moral reasoning, and post-conventional level of moral reasoning. So pre-conventional, basically, people at this level do not have the capacity to assume the perspective of others. Their only viewpoint is their own. So think of this as just basically someone that's very selfish. Appeals to social obligations tend to be ineffective. This level encompasses most children and also, by research, about a third of adults. So about a third of adults basically are not really taking on the perceptions of others. They don't behave morally or ethically because of social obligations. But then why do they do it? Because they want to avoid punishment. They want to avoid getting in trouble. So these are people that are basically behaving morally because they're not wanting to see the repercussions or the consequences of violating moral codes. The conventional level of moral reasoning, people can judge right from wrong in terms of what is good for others, as well as society as a whole. Behavior is governed by what is expected of these people by others and social cues. Approximately two-thirds of adults kind of exist in this range. So these are people that actually recognize the difference between right and wrong, can perceive how negative behaviors would be seen poorly by society, and also understand how it might impact others. They're very much going to be driven by appeals to social obligations. And if they're in the proper setting, in other words, if the environment supports moral reasoning and following ethics, they're going to. Finally, according to Kohlberg, there is a post-conventional level of moral reasoning where people judge what is right and wrong based on complex philosophical principles of duty, justice, and rights, and are no longer influenced again by social obligations or taking on the perceptions of others. They basically create their own moral code and live by it. This can be both a positive and a negative. Very few people are actually at this level, and according to Kohlberg, this is the ultimate level. You're no longer basing your morals or ethics on what others tell you, you're basing it on your own personal beliefs. So according to Kohlberg's theory, basically, if we think about this in age range, we can kind of look at how people develop their ideas of ethics and morals. So the very first level is obedience and punishment, usually in infancy. No difference between doing right or wrong. It's basically just avoiding punishment. Self-interest comes into preschool. Interest shift to rewards rather than punishment. So what can I get if I do behave? So as we hit school age, we kind of hit conformity of interpersonal accord. The good boy girl effect happens. And this is basically we want to secure approval by maintaining friendly relationships with others. So it's mainly driven by those social conventions and wanting to be a part of those social groups. Authority and social order happens also at school age, and that is orientation towards fixed rules. The purpose of morality is maintaining the social order. So again, these levels, especially as we hit those level 2 in Kohlberg's theory, are basically we are behaving as expected of us by social convention and by the expectations of the culture that we're within. Now, as we move to teens and adulthood, we might also see more social constructs, mutually beneficial, reciprocity, right and legal right are not always the same thing, and utilitarian rules that make life better for everyone. So this is where people start to kind of think about, just because it's expected, is it actually better for everyone? And finally, we've got those universal principles that can happen in adulthood, but again, according to Kohlberg, they're fairly rare. Morality is based on principles that transcend mutual benefit and are basically made at a higher level of reasoning. So hopefully coming from this particular subsection of the lecture, we've kind of covered, broadly speaking, the ideas of organizational justice on the individual level and kind of a conceptual framework to think about when we're talking about morals, ethics, decisions to be ethical, and finally the behaviors that are ethical.